Chapter 39. "Well, Miss Dashwood," said Mrs. Jennings, sagaciously smiling, as soon as the gentleman had withdrawn, "I do not ask you what the Colonel has been saying to you, for though, upon my honour, I tried to keep out of hearing, I could not help catching enough to understand his business, and I assure you I was never better pleased in my life, and I wish you joy with all of my heart." "Thank you, ma'am," said Eleanor. "It is a matter of great joy to me, and I feel the goodness of Colonel Brandon most sensibly. There are not many men who would act as he has done. Few people have so compassionate a heart. I was never more astonished in my life." "Lord, my dear, you are very modest. I ain't the least astonished in the world, for I have often thought of the late that there was nothing more likely to happen." "You judged from your knowledge of Colonel's general benevolence, but at least you could not foresee the opportunity that would very soon occur." "Opportunity?" repeated Mrs. Jennings. "Oh, as to that, when a man has once made up his mind to such a thing, somehow or other he will find an opportunity soon. Well, my dear, I wish you joy of it again and again, and if ever there was a happy couple in the world, I think I shall soon know where to look for them." "You mean to go to Delaford after them, I suppose," said Eleanor with a faint smile. "Ay, my dear, I do indeed. And as to the house being a bad one, I do not know what the Colonel would be at, for it is as good one as I ever saw." "He spoke of it being out of repair." "Well, and whose fault is that? Why won't he repair it? Who should do it but himself?" They were interrupted by the servants coming in to announce the carriage being at the door, and Mrs. Jennings, immediately preparing to go, said, "Well, my dear, I must be gone. I have had my talk out. But, however, we may have it all over in the evening, for we shall be quite alone. I do not ask you to go with me, for I dare say your mind is too full of the matter to care for company, and besides, you must long to tell your sister about it." Marianne had left the room before the conversation began. "Certainly, ma'am, I shall tell Marianne of it, but I shall not mention it at present to anybody else." "Oh, very well," said Mrs. Jennings, rather disappointed. "Then you would not have me tell it to Lucy, for I think of going so far as Holborn today." "No, ma'am, not even Lucy, if you please. One day's delay will not be very material. Until I have written to Mr. Ferrars, I think it ought not be mentioned to anybody else. I shall do that directly. It is of importance that no time should be lost with him, for he will, of course, have much to do relative to his ordination." This speech at first puzzled Mrs. Jennings exceedingly. Why Mr. Ferrars was to be written about it in such a hurry she could not immediately comprehend. A few moments' reflection, however, produced a very happy idea, and she exclaimed, "Oh ho, I understand you. Mr. Ferrars is to be the man. Well, so much the better for him. Ay, to be sure, he must be ordained in readiness. And I am very glad to find things are so forward between you. But, my dear, it is not this rather out of character? Should not the Colonel write himself? Sure, he is the proper person." Eleanor did not quite understand in the beginning of Mrs. Jennings' speech, neither did she think it worth inquiring into, and therefore only replied to its conclusion. "Colonel Brandon is so delicate a man that he rather wished anyone to announce his intention to Mr. Ferrars than himself." "And so you are forced to do it? Well, that is an odd kind of delicacy. However, I will not disturb you, seeing her prepared to write. You know your own conscious concerns best. So good-bye, my dear. I have not heard anyone to please me so well since Charlotte was brought to bed." And away she went, but returning again in a moment, "I have just been thinking of Betty's sister, my dear. I should be very glad to get her as soon as a good mistress, but whether she would do it for a lady's maid, I am sure I can't tell. She is an excellent housemaid, and works very well at her needle. However, you will think of that at your leisure." "Certainly, ma'am," replied Eleanor, not hearing much of what he said, and more anxious to be alone than to be mistress of the subject. How should she begin? How should she express herself in her note to Edward was now all her concern. The particular circumstances between them made a difficulty of that which to any other person would have been the easiest thing in the world. But she equally feared to say too much or too little, and sat deliberating it over her paper, when the pen in hand, till broken in on by the entrance of Edward himself. He had met Mrs. Jennings at the door on her way to the carriage, and as he came to leave his farewell card, and she, apologizing for not returning it herself, had obliged him to enter by saying that Miss Dashwood was above, and wanted to speak with him on a very peculiar business. Eleanor had just been congratulating herself in the midst of her perplexity that, however difficult it may be to express herself properly by letter, it was at least preferable to giving him the information by word of mouth, when her visitor entered, to force upon her this greatest exertion of all. Her astonishment and confusion were very great on his so sudden appearance. She had not seen him before since his engagement became public, and therefore not since his knowing her to be acquainted with it, which, with the consciousness of what she had been thinking of, and what she had to tell him, made her feel particularly uncomfortable for some minutes. He was too much distressed, and they sat down together in a most promising state of embarrassment. Whether he had asked her to pardon for his intrusion on first coming into the room, he could not recollect, but determining to be on the safe side, he made his apology in form as soon as he could say anything after taking a chair. "Mrs. Jennings told me," said he, "that you wished to speak to me. At least I understood her so, or I certainly should not have intruded on you in such a manner, though, at the time, I should have been extremely sorry to leave London without seeing you and your sister, especially as it most likely to be some time. It is not probable that I should soon have the pleasure of meeting you again. I go to Oxford tomorrow." "You would not have gone, however," said Eleanor, recovering herself, and determined to get over what she much dreaded as soon as possible, "without receiving our good wishes, even if we had not been able to give them in person. Mrs. Jennings was quite right in what she said. I have something of consequence to inform you of, which I was in the point of communicating by paper. I am charged with a most agreeable office," breathing rather faster as usual as she spoke. "Colonel Brandon, who was here only 10 minutes ago, has desired me to say that, understanding you mean to take orders, he has a great pleasure in offering you the living of Delaford, and now just vacant, and only wishes it were more valuable. Allow me to congratulate you on having so respectable and well-judging a friend, and to join in his wish that was the living. It is about 200 a year, were more considerable, and such might be better enable you as to might be more than a temporary accommodation to yourself, such in short as might establish you in your views of happiness." What Edward felt, as he could not say it himself, it cannot be expected that anyone should say for him. He looked all the astonishment which such unexpected, such unthought-of information could not fail of exerting, but he said only these 2 words. "Colonel Brandon?" "Yes," continued Eleanor, gathering more resolution, as some of the worst was over. "Colonel Brandon means it as a testimony for his concern of what has lately passed, for the cruel situation in which the unjustifiable conduct of your family has placed you, a concern which I am sure Marianne, myself, and all your friends must share, and as likewise a proof of his high esteem for your general character, and as a particular approbation for your behaviour on the present occasion." "Colonel Brandon give me a living? Can it be possible?" "The unkindness of your own relations has made you astonished to find friendship elsewhere." "No," replied he, with sudden consciousness, "not to find it in you, for I cannot be ignorant that you, in your goodness, I owe it all. I feel it. I would express it if I could, but, as you well know, I am no orator." "You are very much mistaken. I do assure you that you owe it entirely, at least almost entirely, to your own merit, and Colonel Brandon's discernment of it. I have had no hand in it. I did not even know, till I understood his design, that the living was vacant, nor had it ever occurred to me that he might have had such a living in his gift. As a friend of mine, of my family, he may perhaps indeed know he has still greater pleasure in bestowing it, but, upon my word, you owe nothing to my solicitation." Truth obliged her to acknowledge some small share in the action, but she was at the same time so unwilling to appear as the benefactress of Edward that she acknowledged it with hesitation, which probably contributed to fix that suspicion in his mind which had recently entered it. For a short time he sat in deep thought of. After Eleanor had ceased to speak, at last, as if it were rather an effort, he said, "Colonel Brandon seems a man of great worth and respectability. I have always heard him spoken of as such, and your brother, I know, esteems him highly. He is undoubtedly a sensible man, and his manners perfectly the gentleman." "Indeed," said Eleanor. "I believe that you will find him, on further acquaintance, all that you have heard him to be, and as you will be such a very near neighbour, for I understand that the parsonage is almost close to the mansion house, it is particularly important that he should be all of this." Edward made no answer, but when she had turned away her head, gave her a look so serious, so earnest, so uncheerful, as to seem to say that he might hereafter wish the distance between the parsonage and the mansion house much greater. "Colonel Brandon, I think, lodges in St. James's Street?" said he, soon afterwards, rising from his chair. Eleanor told him the number of the house. "I must hurry away, then, to give him those thanks which you will not allow me to give to you, to assure him that he has made me an exceedingly happy man." Eleanor did not offer to detain him, and they parted with a very earnest assurance on her side of her unceasing good wishes for happiness in every change of situation that might befall him, on his, with rather an attempt to return to the same goodwill than the power of expressing it. "When I see him again," Eleanor said to herself, as the door shut him out, "I shall see him the husband of Lucy." And with this pleasing anticipation she sat down to reconsider the past, recall the words, and endeavour to comprehend all the feelings of Edward, and of course to reflect on her own discontent. When Mrs. Jennings came home, though she returned from seeing people who she had never seen before, and of whom therefore she must have a very great deal to say, her mind was so much more occupied by the important secret in her possession than by anything else that she reverted to again as soon as Eleanor appeared. "Well, my dear," she cried, "I sent you up to the young man. Did I not do right? Am I to suppose you had no great difficulty? You did not find him very unwilling to accept your proposal?" "No, ma'am, that was not very likely." "Well, and how soon will he be ready? For it seems to depend all upon that." "Really," said Eleanor, "I know so little of these kind of forms that I can hardly even conjecture at the time or to the preparation necessary. But I suppose 2 or 3 months will complete his ordination." "2 or 3 months!" cried Mrs. Jennings. "Lord, my dear, how calmly you talk of it! And can the colonel wait 2 or 3 months? Lord bless me, I am sure it would be quite out of my patience. And though one would be very glad to do all the kindness by poor Mr. Ferris, I do think it is not worth the while to wait 2 or 3 months for him. Sure, somebody else might be found that would do as well, and somebody that is in orders already." "My dear ma'am," said Eleanor, "what can you be thinking of? Why, Colonel Brandon's only object is to be of use to Mr. Ferris." "Lord bless you, my dear, sure you do not mean to persuade me that Colonel only marries you for the sake of giving 10 guineas to Mr. Ferris?" The deception could not continue after this, and an explanation immediately took place, by which both gained considerable amusement for the moment, without any material loss of happiness to either. For Mrs. Jennings only exchanged one form of delight for another, and still without forfeiting her expectation of the first. "Ay, the parsonage is but a small one," she said, after the first ebullition of surprise and satisfaction was over, "and very likely may be out of repair. But to hear a man apologizing, I thought for a house that to my knowledge have 5 sitting rooms on the ground floor, and, I think the housekeeper told me, could make up 15 beds. And you too, that have been used to live in Barton Cottage. It seemed quite ridiculous. But, my dear, we must touch up the colonel to do something to the parsonage, and make it comfortable for them, before Lucy goes to it." "But Colonel Brandon does not seem to have any idea of the living being enough to allow to marry." "The colonel is a ninny, my dear, because he has 2,000 a year himself, and thinks that nobody else can marry on less. Take my word for it that, if I am alive, I shall be paying a visit to Delaford Parsonage before Michaelmas, and I am sure I shan't go if Lucy ain't there." Eleanor was quite of her opinion as to the probability of their not waiting for anything more.